When it comes to doing history, this is probably the most basic question that we start with. How do we know? That is, how do we know history? How do we know anything at all about what's already happened? The farther we move in time away from any historical event, the fewer human beings were actually witnesses. In fact, living human beings have a tiny, infinitesimal memory in terms of historical time. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years have passed since humans first started showing signs of being, human. Until we invent a time machine and go view it for ourselves, how can we say anything for sure about the past? How do we know anything about the past? For historians, the answer to that big question is found in historical sources.
And there are two, well actually there's three kinds of historical sources that you'll need to consult in order to begin constructing answers to your questions about the past. For simplicity's sake, we divide these sources into primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are the most important pieces of information about any historical time or event. They are the materials produced by the people or groups of people directly involved in the event or topic under consideration, either as participants or as witnesses. In other words, they're first-hand accounts, sources created during the period that you're studying. For example, if you're researching the history of World War I, your primary sources would have been created in the years from 1914 to 1920. They are sources from the time period that you're studying. Primary sources include a huge array of materials. For example, letters, diaries, newspaper and magazine articles, speeches, government documents, census data, and official records like marriage records, birth certificates, death registers, and on and on and on. This is just a small glimpse at the kinds of things that we can use as primary sources. And as you can see from looking at this list right here, primary sources are most often written documents, but they can include also non-written sources. For example, primary sources might include works of art, films, recordings, household objects and clothing, tools, etc., and so on. We can also include, for recent history and for older history, oral sources that can be used as primary evidence. So for example, interviews with war veterans about their experiences, or testimony from survivors of the Holocaust. Oral histories could be considered primary sources. The key to what makes these primary sources is that they provide first-hand insights into the thoughts, behaviors, attitudes, and experiences of the people of the past. Such sources are the first and most crucial pieces of evidence that we use to understand and evaluate history. They are a proof that history happened. Now, as a student of history, you'll also need to use secondary sources. Unlike primary sources, secondary sources are texts that are written or created by people who were not eyewitnesses to the events or period in question. Instead, they were the authors of secondary sources synthesize, analyze, and interpret primary sources. Such sources were written later, usually much later, by scholars and others investigating the past. Who writes secondary sources? Well, mostly historians. Every book or article written by a historian is a secondary source, in which the author has used primary sources and other secondary sources to create an account of the past. Historians write a lot, and they write about any and everything. For example, here's a recent book about Ronald Reagan by historian H.W. Brands. Here's a book by historian Pekka Hämäläinen about the Comanche Empire in North America. And here's a recent book by historian Jill Lepore on the secret history of Wonder Woman. There is nothing that human beings have ever done in the past that is not game for historians to write about. Scholarly work in other fields besides history also can be used as secondary sources if they're appropriate. So anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, literary critics, and many, many more scholars also use primary historical sources to build arguments that are useful to historians. In addition, popular writers and journalists may also write books and articles that a student of history can draw on. However, for academic papers and assignments, your best bet is to consult scholarly works, not popular ones. Almost every history class has at least one standard example of a secondary source, and that's your course textbook. Your textbook was written by one or more likely many historians who have pulled together an enormous amount of primary and secondary research to deliver the most up-to-date version of the history of the course subject. And as a special note, there's something that we call tertiary sources. That's the third degree of sources that you should recognize as a student of history. You'll often encounter this third type of source. The most common example of a tertiary source is reference books like dictionaries or encyclopedias. Unlike secondary sources which reflect new research, these sources tend to be syntheses of other secondary sources, and they can be useful to get you started in your research. For example, online you have a source like Wikipedia. It can be really helpful to get kind of moving along and get some ideas and moving in the right direction. But tertiary sources like encyclopedias and wikis are not acceptable as citations in academic papers, at least not yet. You're going to be evaluating both primary and secondary sources in most history classes. And when you do, instead of reading the document passively, approach the source critically. Study and read the primary source as an investigator with a list of questions that you need answers to. Start with the basics. What is the source? Is it a letter, a speech, a pamphlet, an advertisement? What? Who is the author? Beyond just knowing the name of the author, who is the person? Is it a president, a sweatshop worker, a slave, etc.? When was the source written? You're going to need to locate that source in time because that's what history is all about. Where is the source from? Why was it written? That is, what is the purpose of the source? And who was the intended audience? Was this a speech delivered before wealthy financiers? Was it a department store catalog directed at middle-class women? Was it a labor union pamphlet written for railroad workers? Determining the motive of and audience for the source is going to affect your evaluation of it.
There you have the basics. What, who, when, where, why. You want to try to nail these things down even actually before you start reading the primary source itself so you can know what you're looking at. And it'll help you understand what you're reading a lot more to have these kind of questions identified. But now comes really the key question here. What was the historical context in which the source was written? That is, what was happening at that time and place? What do you need to know about the time and place in which the source was written in order to really understand it? This is a really important question. It's the key question when you're doing history. And it also requires some research to answer, but it leads to the much more substantial analysis. So to show you what critical analysis of a primary source looks like in practice, let's take an example here. Here we have the text of an address, that is a speech. If that was all I told you, you wouldn't be able to say very much about this as a source at all. So I'll start filling in some of the basics. The address was written by George Washington. And it was first published on September 19th, 1796 in Philadelphia's newspaper, the Daily Advertiser. So you can get all this information really quick. You have a much better idea of what you're looking at when you know this data. Now for the big question of why. Well, if you know this date in American history, 1796, you'd know that this was the last year that Washington was president of the United States. And indeed, this was his farewell address to the nation, written to leave behind his parting advice to the country based on his long career as military commander and president. Now again, this is all just the basics. Now we want to move into some critical analysis. And to do that, let's take some quotes from the address. So you already know this basic information, now you start reading it. And you see text like this: the name of American, which belongs to you, in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. You can forgive George Washington for his old English style here. Sometimes takes a little effort to translate it into modern English. Another quote: the very idea, the power, and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. Okay, so think about these quotes as I read them. Finally, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible.
Now, here are just three quotes. You can read these and you can do a very surface analysis of these lines. You could say, yeah, sure, Washington is encouraging Americans to be patriotic, to be loyal to the government, to avoid foreign entanglements. All that is fine, and it's accurate, but it's not historical analysis. All it's doing is analyzing what the words say and what they mean. It's not putting it in its historical context. A historian will read these lines and ask historical questions like, why is Washington saying these things at this particular time? Or what does his speech tell us about American politics in the mid 1790s? To do this, you do a little research. You have to know some of the context. You have to go beyond just reading the primary source and look at secondary sources to understand what was going on when the source was written. And you do a little research and you find out that Washington was coming to the end of a very turbulent period in American history. It wasn't at all clear that Americans were going to pledge their main loyalty to the national government created by the Constitution in 1789. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry before the founders, united in the American Revolution against Britain, immediately fought with each other over the future of the nation, almost against the wishes of everyone involved. Political parties emerged, causing division and conflict in American government. And Americans were divided in their loyalties, some pledging number one allegiance to the Federal Republic, others devoted to their individual states, considering themselves to be Virginians or Bostonians or South Carolinians first and foremost before being Americans. Knowing this adds an entirely new level of understanding to what this document actually means. When Washington talks about loyalty to the nation above all other local discriminations, the political party battles and the struggles between local, state, and national allegiance is the specific context of his remarks. His worry that Americans will not dedicate themselves to the nation is based on his personal experience of patriotism to individual states, or what he calls local discriminations. In fact, in 1791, during his first term as President of the United States, open rebellion broke out in western Pennsylvania against the first federal tax levied on the grain used to make whiskey. American farmers in Pennsylvania insisted that they had the right to refuse the payment of the whiskey tax, just as they had resisted British tax laws in the lead up to the American Revolution. And just as in the American Revolution, these tax resistors used violence and intimidation against federal officials, with 500 armed men attacking the home of local Inspector John Neville. Now, what was Washington's response to this whiskey rebellion? Well, he got on a horse and personally led a militia of 13,000 men into Pennsylvania to put down what he saw as an insurgency. His show of force was decisive, and the rebels backed down, with only 20 of them arrested. Now, knowing about this historical event, the Whiskey Rebellion, it's now very clear what he's referring to when he spoke about the duty of every individual to obey the established government. He felt the need to warn Americans that now that the Constitution had been established, that is, the government of the people, Americans must obey the government. Why did he say this? Because he saw with his own eyes armed insurrection against the whiskey tax. Now, all throughout Washington's presidency, the new and fragile nation faced hostility from Spain on its western borders and threats of war from both France and Britain. And there were deep fears among nation's leaders that the U.S. might not even survive. Indeed, the infant United States found itself in a real diplomatic dilemma when France broke out into its own revolution, the same year as the enactment of the U.S. Constitution in 1789. Most Americans supported the French Revolution, and many Americans supported it. And after all, the U.S. had signed a military alliance with France during the American Revolution. But things got complicated when war erupted between France and Britain in 1793. Having provided critical assistance to the United States in its own battle against Britain, France now expected the favor returned in kind. Washington did everything he could as president to remain neutral in this internal conflict between France and Britain, convinced that the United States was not ready for another war. So in this light, his advice about having as little political connection with foreign countries as possible is not just something he thought up out of the blue. It came from 8 long years of conflict with Spain, France, and Britain that threatened to destroy the new United States. That is what we call historical context, and that's what I want you to be thinking about. What is the historical context of the primary sources that you're evaluating? Now that you have the basic context for the source from secondary sources, like your textbook, it is like you're able to decode it. Language and elements that were confusing start to make sense, and you get a richer appreciation for what the document reveals about the time, place, and people, about history.
Okay, thanks for making it through to the end of this video. This last little piece here is just a quick overview of what we're doing now in week 5. As you know, week 5's topic is Africa and the Atlantic world. So we're moving on to that region or that section of the world. There's a study guide for quiz number 3 that's uploaded in the week 5 module. So use those study questions to organize, your research and your reading of the week's materials. Watch this video, Working with Sources, which you just did, so you can check that off the list. And then read chapter 25 of Traditions and Encounters. And then I want you to select one primary source of your choice from the course archive, and that is the section called 1500 to 1800. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So in the module section in Canvas, as you all know, there is a module called Archive, under which is Documents. When you look inside Documents, those are begin with primary sources that are broken down into historical periods. Here we see 1500 to 1800, and under here is a whole collection of documents. What I want you to do is select just one of your choice, but I want you to pick a document that is part of a region that we've already covered. So for example, this first one here is an account of sailing around the Indian Ocean, which we did in the second week of class. Here's one about Africa and Portugal, and we just covered sub-Saharan Africa right now. There's other documents here about the Americas, the West Indies, more documents about the African slave trade, but then there's some documents in here that are East Asia, Japan. We haven't covered those yet, so pick something that we've already covered from the regions up until this point in week 5. Any document you'd like from any of the regions that we've already covered, and select that as your document for the quiz. And you'll see in the study guide that the last question for quiz number 3 is based on your reading of the primary source that you select and putting it in the context based on the textbook. As usual, make sure to post your initial thoughts and comments and questions about the material for the week by Thursday, and then any of follow-ups by Sunday on the week 5 discussion board. And then quiz number 3 will be due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. February 24th. In the meantime, I'm also going to be reading through your proposals for the research paper. I'm really excited about that, to see what you're all coming up with, and I'll be sending you back extensive comments and feedback and telling you what the next stage is in the project. So later on this week, in a sort of mid-week review, I'm going to give you more information about what we're doing next in the research paper. But for now, just concentrate on the work for week 5, Africa and the Atlantic world. I'm really excited to hear what you all think about the material for this week and how you're putting it in the context of the story that we've been following so far. And have a great week, and I'll see you on the discussion board.